Hey, all right.
So I thought I'd show the current front page of the field guide, and it looks like that. I need to let me do this so I can see what I'm doing, like that. And my own book looks like that. I'm sure most of you are familiar with Dad's work, but it doesn't hurt to start with the basics. He was born in 1908 in Jamestown, New York, and Jamestown in those days was a small manufacturing town in upstate New York on Lake Chautauqua. Jamestown also had the Chautauqua Institute very nearby, right on the shores of the lake. And so it was a fairly enlightened area. It was also surrounded by some beautiful country. My father grew up in a tiny house, truly tiny. And it was he and his sister, his mother and father, and then 6 relatives. So it was a fairly packed house. So by way of entertainment, Dad would take himself out behind the house, which in those days was called the 100-acre wilderness, because literally there was nothing there. And so he would go in there and just mess about and see what he could see. At a fairly early age, he started getting interested in the things that he was seeing and trying to put names to them and this and that. And like most people who get early on interested in natural history, he began with insects. As a matter of fact, at some point later in his life, in his early teens, mid-teens, the local sheriff gave him a dispensation to go out in the evenings after curfew. In those days, they had a curfew for all the kids. And he could go out after curfew and hunt moths under the street lamps. Anyway, Dad was born in 1908. This is about, let's see, it's about, I'd say 1905. It'd be 3 years after the National Association of Audubon Societies was put together as an overall organization. It had its beginnings in Boston with a group of ladies who were very upset about the usage of birds' feathers in hats. And matter of fact, the populations of herons and egrets in southern Florida were being decimated at this time. And what was happening is that people were going out, they were shooting the adult birds for their feathers and leaving the chicks in the nests to die, basically. So early on, the ladies began the Audubon Society. This is also, about 5 years before Dad was born, the first bird sanctuary was formed. This is during the tenure of Teddy Roosevelt. And so all sorts of neat stuff was going on in the world of environmental legislation, the formation of parks and so forth and so on. But it was early on. In general, the public was not really cognizant of this sort of thing. And that's where Dad came in. He basically spent most of his time out in the woods and fields, and somewhere around his 7th grade year, his teacher formed an after-hours nature club. It was a kind of an adjunct of the Audubon Society, and for 10 cents a month, they would get a bunch of literature on a specific bird. They would get line drawings that they could color, and they would go on walks. He and 2 or 3 other friends would go out together and go bird watching at this point. And it started out as a mild thing, but fairly early on, they came across a bird that was on the side of the road that looked like it was dead. It was just a pile of brown feathers, and they kind of dared one another, and so Dad went up and touched it, and all of a sudden it exploded into life. It was a yellow-shafted flicker, and after that he was hooked. So anyway, Dad graduated high school in 1925 or so. He went to work for a furniture company in Jamestown, drawing images on the furniture. An awful lot of the furniture were cabinets to hide liquor in those days. And the images were basically Asian motifs. So for years has tried to find examples of the furniture, but we have yet to be able to do so. So about that time, he got enough money to take himself down to New York and went to an American Ornithological Union meeting in the city, and met a couple of really influential people in his life. One was Chapman, who at that time was the real expert on identifying birds in North America. Also, Luis Agassiz Fuertes, who was the preeminent bird artist at that time. And so he came back to Jamestown, earned more money, and on the recommendation of the head artist at the furniture company, he went down to New York and started studying at the the Arts Student League in New York, and did that for a couple of years. That was a free organization, or nominal fee. And he would back and forth there to Jamestown to make more money. And then he also got a job with a furniture company in the New York City area, also drawing on the furniture. After 2 years, he got a scholarship to the National Academy of Design, learning more formal painting, and spent his 2 years there. During this period, he hooked up with a bunch of people, people his own age, who formed a group called the Bronx County Birding Club. And they would go out whenever they had free time, mostly on the weekends, but during the week if they had free time, birding in the New York City area. Their mentor was a guy named Ludlow Griscom, who was at the Museum of Natural History in New York at the time. And Ludlow Griscom was one of the proponents, the early proponents, of identifying birds, not through a shotgun, but through binoculars. This was a fairly competitive group of guys that would go out and bird, and they would share their information, and they would do photography as well as the binoculars. And they benefited from the fact that during the First World War, binoculars became much more commonplace and much less expensive. Cameras came into being thanks to Browning and Kodak, Eastman Kodak. And it made it possible for the average person to save up enough money to get their own camera and binoculars. One of the trips they took was out into the marshes of New Jersey, northern New Jersey. And on the way back from their birding trip, my father and a friend were talking back and forth about things, and Dad was saying something to the effect of, "Gee, I wish we had a really good field guide to use out here," because up to that point you just had Chapman's book, which was The Birds of North America, which is a heavy tome, and it was very wordy. Descriptions of birds were very lengthy. And the only other book was Chester Reed's book, which was just a fairly small, true pocket guide, but it was just a straight line listing of 50 to 75 species with illustrations and some text, but it wasn't very thorough, and it didn't really do any kind of comparison imagery of the birds. It was possible to identify things using that book, but it was a trickier trickier deal. Dad had read early on when he was a young kid, Ernest Thompson Seton's books, and one in particular called Two Little Savages had a couple of plates where one of the protagonists in the book was identifying ducks on a lake. And Seton had laid it out just the way Dad's later field guides were, which is that he had similar looking ducks placed on the same plate next to one another in the same position, and was pointing out the differences in the pattern of the duck. Later, Dad would use that idea. It was a very simple idea of just using similar looking species in similar poses, and pointing out their differences with arrows. It was much like using an iPad these days. It was just intuitive. It took almost no time at all to get familiar with what the system was or what it meant. And accompanying the illustration would be a short text that would briefly describe the identifying characteristics of the bird. For example, to show you a difference, in Chapman's Birds of North America, he has about 8 lines describing a robin, and the robin's red breast is about the 5th line of the text. My father's text next to the illustration of a red robin was the bird that everyone knows. But it was that sort of simplification. He always likened writing a field guide to writing a telegram. It was how to, inculcate the most information in the least amount of space. That, coupled with the illustration, was revolutionary. And all of that information could be put into a size that one could put into their pocket, hence the modern field guide. Others have used that same technique over the years to do field guides, but no one really, to my mind, has ever done something better. They may have more information, but the basic ability to identify birds on the wing is best served by those field guides. So Dad basically had this conversation with his friend, and his friend said, well, gee, Roger, you have all this information. You have the skills to illustrate it. Why don't you do a book, and I'll find you a publisher? Well, the friend wasn't able to find him a publisher, but several years later, Dad, when he got out of the Institute, ended up being a nature counselor in a boys' camp in Maine. And the man who ran the camp was also the headmaster of Rivers Country Day just outside of Boston, and managed, this is in the depths of the Depression, and Dad managed to get a job with Clarence Allen at Rivers Country Day, teaching science and art. And that's where he completed the first version of the Birds of Eastern Birds guide. And because he knew people in Boston, he through the Linnaean Society, which is an organization dedicated to natural history study, he connected with Houghton Mifflin, the publisher in Boston, and in 1934 the first field guide was released. One of the extraordinary things about Dad's life is the degree to which his friendships and the networking that he did with fellow enthusiasts influenced the whole thing. Early on, as it had been when he was 17, he managed to he took himself to New York to go to the AOU meeting, which was, people that were basically much older than he. And then he also took a train trip down to South Carolina, and managed to connect with the local birders. Throughout his life, he spent a great deal of time corresponding with people. And so he had one of the finest networks of people who were authorities on various aspects of either ornithology or other disciplines. So that first field guide in 1934 was almost an instant success. He'd been networking with the people in Boston, doing Christmas counts and so forth and so on, and he'd been pre-selling his book. And so when the first book came out, it sold out in 2 weeks, and has since gone on to 20 some odd million copies. The Field Guide series itself lent itself to various disciplines and grew from that first field guide to over 50 different titles. Let me do this. Let's see. And the Bronx County Birding Club was very influential in the fact that it was a very collegial group. It was competitive, but they all shared information, and it laid the groundwork for the way ornithology is these days, where it seems to be not just competitive, but very, very collegial in scope. People like sharing information. So between the Bronx County Birding Club and teaching in boys camp, Dad had this, and then the first field guide, Dad had this groundwork of not just information, but also expertise in teaching, and was hired by the National Audubon Society in their New York offices to, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good, because all of a sudden I'm getting a blank screen. So we went to work for the National Audubon Society in New York as their art director, and then became the head of their educational arm. And all of those pamphlets that Dad had used as a seventh grader, he was put in charge of those. And over his tenure at the Audubon in New York, he revamped the whole pamphlet series. And over his tenure, they quintupled the membership in the Audubon Society. It had an extraordinary impact in that. And then, so basically, to everything led from there. Of course, the Second World War came up, and all of a sudden, Dad was in the Army, ending up as a sergeant. The Army used, and the military used his field guide system for plane identification. It was the same idea, just show similar looking planes side by side, and then point out what the differences were, so they could tell, which Japanese plane they were looking at, which German plane was being looked at. Towards the tail end of it, and they used him for all sorts of things. He was basically being used, much of it, he was being used as an artist. And there's a wonderful letter that he wrote home to my mother at some point, saying, I think I may know more about demolition than I ever wanted to know. He'd spent the last 6 months putting together a pamphlet on demolition and how to defuse bombs and this and that. Towards the end of the war, he spent time in Florida doing studies with DDT. The military wanted to know what the harmful effects would be on on populations, and specifically bird populations, through the use of DDT. A lot of that information that he put together during the latter part of the war, he shared with a friend of his in Chevy Chase, Maryland, which is where we moved after the war in the early 50s. And that friend was Rachel Carson. Mm. So he had a lot of impact through the Audubon Society and Chevy Chase with her. Somewhere, throughout all this period, he was doing magazine articles and this and that. in the early 50s, around 1950 or so, he went to an ornithological meeting in England and connected with a guy named James Fisher, with whom he became best friends. And the two of them got together in the early 50s and traveled around the country and produced a book together. And the book was called Wild America. And it was basically starting in Newfoundland and then did a circuit of the country. Dad had done, the previous winter, Dad had put together an itinerary where they could see what birds they could see, and came up with an enormous number of different species of birds during this trip. And essentially each chapter would begin with Dad laying down kind of a historical and positional description. And then James would chime in with a description of the birds they were seeing and the impressions they were getting of what they were seeing. That book inspired a whole generation of ornithologists, to the extent that 20 years later, Kencoffman, who also produces field guides today, took himself around the country trying to top the grand total of birds that Dad had seen in that Wild America tour. Another person who did the same thing more recently was a guy that you maybe or may not be familiar with, but should be, Scott Wiedensaw. And Scott's written on a number of different natural history subjects, but he also did a reprise of the Wild America itinerary, stopping at each and every one of the places that Dad had stopped and had described, and described them as they are now. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. And of course, Dad, once he got out of the military, revised the Eastern Bird Guide, and that was the one that I learned my birds with, was the 1948 version. But then it went on to various iterations, including the more recent one, which is this. And actually on the anniversary of the field guide, they released this, which was essentially a combination of the Eastern and Western field guides. And it's a wonderful book. It's not exactly a field guide because it's a bit big for a pocket, but when I was a kid, I went to the same summer camp as a camper that my father had gone to as a counselor. My godfather actually was the director of the camp. And on rainy days, they had a big old white farmhouse. And on rainy days, we'd sit on the big porch and listen to the rain. And then we'd go through various books. And Chester Reed's Bird Guide, which had perfectly good illustrations for kids, was one of those books that I would go through. And I can remember looking at a prothronotary warbler in Maine in that book, in a place where it did not occur. And some 30 years later, and it had not seen it until I was in my mid-30s in Louisiana, and a friend and I were in the middle of a cypress swamp, and there was a prothronotary warbler. And I knew immediately what I was looking at because we sat there and looked at things on that porch. This combined book was kind of like that. It's one of those coffee table books that you can thumb through, and the illustration is just gorgeous, and you just imagine seeing those birds for the first time. So a couple of things. I don't have any visual things to show you, but I do have some recommendations, and perhaps the easiest one is you can just Google Roger Tory Peterson, and you'll see various subject headings. One is videos. And if you go to videos, there's a wonderful little video that was put together for the field guide when it came out in this one that I was just showing you, called Almost Like Resurrection, which is the kind of the story of seeing that flicker for the first time and just being agog. But it traces his early life and goes on. And there's some other videos as well. If you want to read a an excellent biography. This one is a good one. This is by Elizabeth Rosenthal, and it's just Birdwatcher and the life of Roger Tory Peterson, but it's really good. So for me, I thought I'd throw in, how did I get into edible wild plants? And it was being in summer camp and as a counselor at this point, because after I was a camper, I went on to be a counselor for 3 or 4 years. A friend handed me, I was using, Dad had just come out 3 or 4 years earlier with a wildflower guide, and someone handed me a copy of Yule Gibbon's Stalking the Wild Asparagus. And it was a natural to combine the two books into one, and it led to me doing my own book. Once I was comfortable identifying things using the flower guide and other guides, then actually using them became pretty easy. So I'm open to questions. Just ask away, whoever wants to, either about Dad and his life or my own expertise. Anyone want to chime in?
Hi, it's Jane. So I'll start.
Okay.
So when did you kind of realize your dad was famous or special or different?
Well, that's the problem. I think early on, no. Your dad is your dad. And I just knew he knew some stuff. So if I found a bird's nest I needed identifying, or I was also collecting insects as a kid too. And so I'd use his books. And if I had trouble figuring out something, I'd ask him. But you don't think much about it. I think I must have been probably about 10 or 11. And we went to a lecture that he gave in New London, Connecticut, which is where the submarine base was. And it was Connecticut College is where he was giving the talk. And I didn't, the lecture was just the lecture. Dad knows some stuff, and I knew that. But it was after the lecture when people started clustering around and just the way they were interacting with him. And that's probably the first time I realized that he was something a little different. The extraordinary thing about Dad was how much he shared of himself with the people that were interested in either birds or anything really. Dad ended up making himself one of the best field naturalists in the country in his time. And so he just knew stuff. Next question. Well.
Hi.
Oh.
I got one. So did your dad keep a life list?
Early on, he kept a life list. I mean, everyone kind of starts that way. I mean, it's and I did too as a kid. I mean, you start a life list and you keep on adding to it, but at some point, and then you do, big sits and stuff like that, where you see how many species you can see in a day, or from a particular position, or this or that. But at some point, it becomes less important. And so at some point, I think he kind of stopped keeping a tab on how many different species he'd seen. I mean, there were people who were intense about it. We had a family friend who was one of the heirs of Bosch and Loam, and he had his own plane, and if he heard of a sighting of an unusual bird, he would fly off to it. And he had an incredible a life list of birds. But for Dad, somewhere along the line, it stopped being as important to him.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that's always been remarkable about him is how focused he was on birds and the consistency of that focus. I mean, 60 years or more of just being intensely interested in them. He was probably one of the hardest. He was kind of a contradiction. At one of the same time, he was one of the hardest working people that I knew, and he was also one of the laziest people that I know. He was a great procrastinator, and he'd be up in the studio, he'd be reading Time magazine or something else, you know, and just putting things off. But he was also one of the most chronically overcommitted people that I've ever met. And he used that overcommitment to force him to the task. It was not necessarily the happiest things for him at times, because he always kind of referred to doing a field guide as serving a prison sentence. And he was right. For 2, 3, 4 years, you're chained to your easel, to your desk. Your mobility is limited at that point. But then it's over, and you have that freedom to travel and do other things. The other thing that always amazed people was how, because of that focus, is how many risks he would take. There's one story that comes out of Camp Shawanki, which was that boys' camp on the coast of Maine that Dad taught at. And it was of Dad taking his camera, seeing a moose who trotted through the camp, seeing the moose and chasing after the moose, trying to get a good picture. And then about half an hour later, Dad came racing back through the camp with the moose chasing him, and ended up in top of in a tree. There's a wonderful photograph. I don't know where it is these days, if it still exists or not, but there's this wonderful photograph of a moose taken from above. And I would look at that thing for years and had no idea where it had come from. And it turned out that was the photograph that Dad had taken being chased by the moose. Another one of his friends told me a story of them in the Privilos, and he's hanging over a cliff with the guy holding his ankles so he wouldn't fall, so he could get a decent picture of a bird that was nesting on the cliff face. It was just this incredibly intense focus on what he was doing. He loved it. More questions?
Yeah, I have a question. Eric Mullenhauer here.
Mhm.
A lot of the old time naturalists, they developed their libraries, and I'm assuming that after your dad passed away, maybe you inherited that library or had some access to it. Were there any books in his library that you think influenced him in terms of creating the field guide that he did?
Well, I mean, other than the Ernest Thompson Seton book, that was one of them, of course. Chapman's book was in the library. Reed's guide was in the library. They were essentially the sorts of books that he was being influenced by. I mean, the Ernest Thompson Seton book, Two Little Savages, gave him that kernel of an approach to solving the problem of bird identification on the wing. Reed's guide and Chapman's guide, a book, were kind of examples of what not to do on a really useful field guide. And so it was just only in a negative sense. I mean, really, we lose sight of it because there are so many field guides out there that what he did was brand new. It was unique. No one had thought to do that before. I mean, it seems extraordinary to think that now when we have so many field guides to choose from, but it was a totally novel approach. He came at just the right time with the right tools. And there was this kind of synergy that occurred between the world of conservation and the information that Dad supplied. They enhanced one another. And the net result, well, as an example, at one time, I can remember having a conversation with an older gentleman back in the 80s, and he said, you know, probably 95 to almost 100% of the professionals in the world of environmental organizations of one sort or another had their beginning using his field guide. It had an extraordinary impact. I mean, as you all know, I mean, once you can put a name to something, I mean, it's a rather basic thing to be able to do, but the minute you can put a name to something, you can talk about it with other people, and you begin to learn more about it, not just how to identify it, but more where it lives, what it does, how it fits into the greater scheme of things. And all of that started with the identification guides, the field guide.
Okay, thank you. One other quick question. Do you have any personal experiences relating to your dad's association with Hawk Mountain and Maurice Brune?
Oh yeah. He obviously there were a bunch of guys that early on went to Hawk Mountain before it was Hawk Mountain, I mean, before it was an established place. And all of those young birders were kind of brought to task to push preserving Hawk Mountain and diminishing the practice of shooting the hawks as they flew down the ridge lines. I have a wonderful photograph of Dad. Basically, he's at Hawk Mountain. He was staying in a little house, a little cabin that's still there. And underneath the cabin was just sort of an overhang with, kind of rustic. And he's in a sleeping bag, and he looks tired. He looks disgruntled. He's just waking up. And he was notorious, they'd spend late evenings, and then he was notoriously hard to get up in the morning. But it's just a wonderful photograph of him there at Hawk Mountain during one of those forays that they all did. The story about that one was that the guys that woke him up had gone out birding early in the morning, and they'd come up with 20 some odd species or this or that, and Dad's rejoinder to that was, well, I've heard 32 just here in my sleeping bag. So that's a neat place, Hawk Mountain.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Well, that's what I have to offer. As I say, a couple of things. Just this is the field guide as it is now. The bird guide. This is my book. And then Elizabeth Rosenthal's The Bird Watcher is another one to take a look at. And then just Google Dad's name, Roger Tory Peterson, and then you'll get a whole host of information there. Let's see, there was something else I was going to mention. Oh yeah, might as well mention Courtney Design, Courtney Design. You can go online, courtneydesign.com, and you can see more about my wife and I and our jewelry and so forth and so on.
So Lee, how active are you birding these days and taking trips?
Well, we've been housebound for a year, basically. Where we are now is a place called Kendall Crosslands, which is in Kennett Square, Pennsylvania. And it's basically a retirement community set in about 500 acres or so. And it's adjacent to Longwood Gardens. Every weekend, a bunch of us get together and bird, but it's more of a sit-down birding rather than traveling about. Courtney and I tend to take the dogs and travel about and go birding as well. But my attention is split between birding, which is probably the least of it, and then botanizing, and then trout fishing. So between all of those things, that motivates our travel. But yeah, I mean, once you get into birding, and I find it's the same way with edible wild plants, that once you get into these subjects and acquire some knowledge in them, you tend to use those subjects as touchstones through your life. I mean, a day doesn't go by where I'm not out there looking at what plants are coming up or what birds are coming through, particularly this time of year with the migratory birds. It's just neat. I mean, to see when they arrive. And my father did the same thing, even when he was suffering his prison sentence of doing a field guide. His studio was I'd say about 1,000 yards from our house, and it was a walk up the hill through the woods, and then into an opening where the studio was. And he would do the same thing. He would check what birds were singing, what birds were arriving or leaving. Later in his life, he planted a butterfly garden, and he checked that as well to see what was coming through.
I have one final question, if you would. It seems to me, and I wouldn't be able to hazard the percentages on this, but it seems to me that a lot of the old time naturalists, and I'll say your dad was an old time naturalist. I'm feeling like an old time naturalist myself these days, but your dad certainly was, and Maurice Brune was, and all the folks back then of that time period. A number of the ones that I know, like Maurice Brune, became very pessimistic as they watched the arc of what was happening with environmental degradation during the course of their lifetime. You don't see it in 10 years or 20 years, but if you live 60 or 70 years, you've seen enough to get some feeling for the arc of where things are going. And they became very pessimistic. And it wasn't just that generation, even William Hornaday back in his generation before became very pessimistic at the arc. John Burroughs, the Catskill naturalist and so on, became very pessimistic. Did your dad get very pessimistic towards the end?
No, I don't think so. I think at his core, he tended to be an optimist. So yeah, he would talk about the things that were no longer here. I mean, but he wouldn't dwell on them. I think that overall his feeling was that there was an enormous capacity for recovery if we just got it right, that we could change our behavior and things would get better. I mean, it's both those things were going on with Dad because he was seeing so much of the world. He had seen it early on before things kind of got to a tipping point, and then he saw it later on as well. I think he remained hopeful on this. That I don't know how else to put it. I think there was that core that was he was optimistic about things. And our capacity to do better.
Yeah, no, I can understand that. I can also say from knowing Maurice Brune that Maurice was very cynical towards the end and did not believe that human behavior would in fact change. It would continue and
well, so much of the negative things that happen are a minority making them happen. There's a great number of people who are positive influences on things. It's just a matter of marshaling their efforts.
right.
So, yeah, I'm not sure how well to answer that question because I know that there had to be things that he would have found upsetting. The fact that he could see pileated woodpeckers and then they were gone.
Yeah.
Fairly early on. On the other hand, I can remember as a kid noticing that all of a sudden we were seeing more cardinals in southern Connecticut than we'd ever seen before. that we were seeing glossy ibises that we had never seen before, that there were changes that occurred that weren't necessarily negative.
Right.
So, well, I mean,
So,
examples would be, I mean, a classic example is actually something like bald eagles and ospreys, the big raptors, and particularly ospreys and bald eagles that are so visible to so many that, you know, we, in the 60s and 70s, attention was paid to them, that we've got some answers to what was going on, and the changes were made, and those populations have recovered. So there are good things that are still happening and recoveries to problems before they're too late.
Yeah, the problem is that we tend to try to save the things that are charismatic.
Yeah, well, you know, like bluebirds.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, another success story, but they're very charismatic. You're right.
Right.
Peregrine falcons. I mean, all those things.
Right.
They tend to be the ones that we pay attention to, and other things just go by the boards without realizing that it's happening.
Yeah, I remember years ago when somebody said that there was a reason why the polar bear became the headliner for doing something about climate change rather than the Glacier Bay wolf spider.
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
So,
they're cute and cuddly, plus they're just spectacular.
yeah.
so one last question, Lee. What is a story about your dad that you feel you could share that we won't read about in a book or online?
Well, you might not be able to read online the moose story. Oh, gee, I don't know. I just know that this is one you won't read about, although it's one that I've described to other people. We had a neighbor up the street from us named Carl Schaeffer, and Carl Schaeffer had been a medical doctor on a German U-boat during the Second World War and had been stationed 10 or 11 miles off of Long Island at one point, and fortunately had been pulled off the U-boats early enough in the war that the attrition didn't catch up with him. But Carl Schaeffer was this wonderful Teutonic guy with the Heidelberg scars, the whole thing, and just a wonderful, gentle man. But he was German, and a couple things come to mind. One is that when Dad and Carl Schaeffer would have conversations, and they really enjoyed having conversations with one another. But I can remember being at a dinner party at their place, and the two of them were in the living room, and the conversational distance of a German is like 12 inches, and the conversational distance of an Englishman or a Swede, like my father, is more like 2 feet and perhaps a little bit more, the comfort zone. And so Carl Schaeffer was always trying to edge up closer to Dad, and Dad was always backing up just a little bit. And neither one was aware that that was happening, but you could see them going around the room like that, having this really intense, wonderful conversation. So that's something you probably won't hear about. Another one was also from Carl Schaeffer, which is that he was very interested in the accumulation of stress in people, and particularly that was one thing he was interested in. And then circadian rhythms he was interested in, and his judgment about my father was that his circadian rhythm was actually about 25 hours or so. Dad, when he would get intensely into a project, would forget to eat, forget to sleep, and this and that. He would work around the clock. And my mother found herself making dinner for breakfast for Dad on occasion, and breakfast for dinner in those time slots for Dad. That was just the way his sleep schedule was going. And I can remember Dad coming in. My bedroom in our house in Connecticut was just above the front door, and I can remember Dad coming in 2, 3, 4 in the morning And he'd always check the screen door there at the front door to see what big moths were there. And in those days, we were getting great big saturnids, cecropias and polyphemuses and ios and lunar moths and so forth, all coming to the lights of the front door. And then I'd hear the sound of the screen door close. And I knew he was home, and I'd go back to sleep. He was, just to give you a last sort of snapshot of Dad, and this was something that a friend of ours named Bob Lewin, who formed a company called Mill Pond Press, which did many of Dad's art prints in the 70s. Bob Lewin made the comment at Dad's memorial that he was somebody who was impressed by numbers. The bigger the number, the more impressed he was. It was one of the things he would do all the time, was to see how many monarch butterflies were coming to the Buddleias, how many flamingos were in the middle of the Salt Lake in the Andes. Numbers. He kept track of numbers and the change in numbers religiously. That's it. Things you might not hear otherwise.
Did your father ever have the opportunity to go to Mexico and see the monarch colonies?
I don't know. It's a shame if he didn't. I have, they're proteges of Dad's who went that I've gotten feedback from, but I don't know if Dad ever did. Although, remember, he co-authored the Mexican Field Guide with Eddie Shalif. So surely he spent some time in Mexico, and that would have been one of those places that they would have heard about. Just to back up a piece and talk about the Bronx County Birding Club, that was a rather extraordinary group of people. It may have been just a dozen or more people. Dad was the only one. Originally, the club rules, which you had to be from the Bronx to belong to the Bronx County Birding Club. And I think Dad was sharp enough with his birding that he was allowed to join. But the members of that club, so many of them ended up doing wonderful things either in the world of ornithology or just natural history in general. A guy named Joe Hickey was part of that group. Eddie Shalif, who co-authored a Mexican Guide, was actually a ballet dancer, and then later formed about 16 dance studios in New York and New Jersey area. But that early interest in birds stayed with him, and people like Bill Voigt, who was the friend that suggested, "Oh, Roger, you could do this field guide." Bill Voigt ended up working for the National Audubon Society in a rather high level. And then Cruikshank was part of that group, and Pettingill was part of that group. They all went, half of them went into academia, half of them went into other walks of life, but contributed in one fashion or another. I had another story, and it's just passed right by. It was a pretty interesting life he led. A bunch of us got together after his memorial and were chatting with one another, and we all decided that he kind of lived the life that we would all like to live. He did the thing that he loved to do. He got a lot of critical acclaim for doing that. And then when he died, he was still dreaming of the next project. He had another project in line. He wasn't done. No more questions. Anybody?
It's Courtney Designs, you said, right?
Yeah, it's Courtney Design, singular, .com. So
Okay.
it's COURTNEYDESIGN. It'll show you, you'll see pictures. It'll talk about us and the jewelry and show you pictures of our farm that we sold about a year ago. Not too far from here. And then catalog.
That was great. Great.
Well, Lee, I want to thank you so much on behalf of the Gloucester County Nature Club for giving this presentation tonight. I think we've learned some very intimate and fascinating details about an extraordinary naturalist and an extraordinary artist, your father.
Yeah,
Thank you again so much for being a part of making this such a fascinating evening for us.
well, I appreciate it. Thank you, Mitch.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.